I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: does Return of the Jedi Luke make sense of Last Jedi Luke? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because more and more I am seeing apologists for The Last Jedi who are now trying to make the claim that Return of the Jedi Luke actually foreshadows the behaviour, the conduct, the characterization of Last Jedi Luke. In fact, we can see some direct parallels, apparently, they claim. And in particular, this moment in The Last Jedi where we see Luke standing over his nephew, who is little older than, childhood. He's still a very young man at this stage, and he is contemplating murdering him in cold blood. And people say, well, that's not really that out of character. If you go and look at Return of the Jedi, remember that scene in Return of the Jedi where Luke is fighting his own father and he ends up going into a frenzy with his lightsaber and he cuts off his own father's hand and he almost kills him before he stops himself. That's the same thing. So that there shows that the Last Jedi characterization of Luke is consistent. This is what we saw already in Return of the Jedi. Now, here's the thing. This isn't true for a couple of reasons. Number one, there is a huge difference. There's a huge context difference between Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi, who is in the heat of battle and who is engaged in an active self-defense and who falls into a passionate frenzy where he almost gives himself over to that emotion and ends up killing someone, compared to Luke Skywalker, who is standing there in a room with someone in their hut while they are sleeping, and he is contemplating an act of premeditated, cold-blooded murder of one of his own family members, one of his sort of star pupil, his student here, who's not an enemy, who's not out to attack him, who is not currently trying to kill him. So those two things, they're not actually parallels. They're not actually things that make sense at all. There isn't really a consistency there at all. Even if you want to buy into that consistency, though, and try and claim that a frenzied act of self-defense where you start to go too far is somehow the same as an act of premeditated, cold-blooded murder of an innocent, well, the thing is what happens next. Now, as I said, I would argue they are not the same thing at all, but what happens next is really a dead giveaway that we're not dealing with the same two characters at all, that the characterization of Luke in The Last Jedi is now something completely different. You see, after that moment, a very brief moment of frenzy, where in an act of over-passionate self-defense, he almost goes too far and gives himself over to that hatred, but then stops, he turns with a hopeful defiance, and he turns to the Emperor and effectively declares quite boldly the hope that he has for the future and the fact that he will not give himself over to the dark side. He will not fall into despair. He doesn't immediately drop to his knees and start crying and saying, "I've gone too far, I've failed, there's no point, this Jedi thing is all just a sham, they're a bunch of losers, I've been tricked." He doesn't do that. There's this hopeful defiance there. That is the hallmark of who Luke Skywalker is. At times, maybe you might argue it's overly hopeful, but there's this hopeful commitment to goodness and to truth. Now, the Last Jedi version of Luke Skywalker, that is not at all what happens. So after this act of contemplated, cold-blooded, premeditated murder of his own young nephew, he then falls into absolute despair. He goes into such a state of nihilistic, depressive despair that he cuts himself off from the Force, and he just rejects everything Jedi as this horrible failed experiment that is worth nothing. It's no one should have anything to do with it, let alone him, who's cut himself off from the Force. Now that is not the same Luke Skywalker at all. That is a completely different character. And Return of the Jedi Luke Skywalker makes absolutely no sense of that characterization. If you want to make Luke that way, which I don't think they ever should have because it's not consistent and it actually isn't, I don't think, good mythology, but if they wanted to make Luke that way, you need to actually do the proper character development. You need to do the hard work of making him that way. Now the thing here though is that's really interesting about this whole comparison between Return of the Jedi and The Last Jedi, and using this as a sort of a defense to try and justify what we see of Luke's characterization in The Last Jedi, is that there's a big irony in this, because some of the same people who will defend to the death the whole characterization of Luke in The Last Jedi are some of the very same people who will then turn around and say to you, oh, you silly crybabies, you silly man babies, you get all upset about this, you're just over-the-top fanboys, this is just a kid's film, calm down. Well, hold on a minute. If this is just a kid's film, and by the way, Star Wars was never just a kid's film, it was always more than that, but let's take that as an underlying assumption and presume that that straw man is true. So it always was just a kid's film. The portrayal of Luke Skywalker that we see in The Last Jedi is not a childlike kid's film version of a character. It's a dark, nihilistic, depressive, almost borderline suicidal character. This is not the thing of kids' movies. So some of the same people who are trying to defend this film and this characterization are also the same people who are trying to claim that everyone who attacks or sees problems with The Last Jedi is somehow just an over-the-top man baby who's forgotten that it's a kid's film. Basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. You can't really say both, because as I said, this characterization is not at all consistent with what you would expect in a basic childlike expression of mythology and mythological storytelling. But leaving that aside, Return of the Jedi Luke Skywalker does not make sense of the characterization of Last Jedi Luke Skywalker. If they wanted to do that, and I still think it would have been a big mistake even if they had done this, but if they wanted to do that, they needed to actually develop that character properly and explain the steps so that we didn't suddenly go from A to Z. There was A, B, C, D, E, and everything else that needed to be there in between, instead of this lazy writing which left us with this characterization that just makes no sense and really is truly awful when you consider all of the goodness and the hopefulness that very much was the heart and soul of the character of Luke Skywalker formerly. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There is a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.